and Charlotte will be our presenter. And what I know that she is a long-time decision modeler who is currently with James Taylor Decision Management Solutions company, and she has experience in the defense industry. And let's see what we will get. Charlotte.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. So today, we're going to be talking about how decision modeling reduces complexity in regulated industries. Organizations in highly regulated industries like healthcare, finance, insurance, energy, etc., are constantly wrestling with how to balance risk and profitability. Compliance and transparency are always top priorities, but so is the bottom line, right? So how do you automate and simplify operations and engage in data-driven decision-making that aligns with regulatory demands and advances positive business outcome? Seems like quite the ask, right? Decision modeling can help your business teams articulate their most important decisions to help drive continuous improvement and greater efficiencies at scale. So in the next little bit here, I, a real-life decision modeler, will show you how it's done in the real world and share feedback from real clients. You'll gain insights on how business stakeholders can build easy-to-explain models in a visual format by leveraging our decision management methodology. So, as a little bit of a TLDR kind of spoiler alert kind of deal, when my screen catches up, maybe we'll see it, maybe we won't. We'll talk about our goals and what we intend to show over the next little bit. So if I had to take a guess as to what brought you here to join this webinar, it'd be that you work in a highly regulated industry like healthcare, finance, insurance, etc., and are curious to see what this decision modeling thing might be able to do for your company. And our goal is to satisfy that curiosity and to get your brain churning about ways that you can see decision modeling solving problems that you face today. And again, as a spoiler alert, a quick payoff. If you can't stick around for the whole thing because you're just too excited about the vendor Q&A, regulated industries are full of decisions, and they're rather complex, regardless of how verbose the regulation that governs them suggests they may be. This makes balancing risk, compliance, transparency, all of these things particularly difficult. Decision modeling manages that complexity by separating the decision out from the process, breaking it down into simple building blocks, describing the rules behind those building blocks so everyone understands them, and precisely defining the data that's required to execute those models. So to that end, how do we reduce complexity in these regulated industries? First, we focus on decision making. Then we look at the decision logic and define it. And by doing so, we're able to more efficiently determine which data is actually needed. And there's some little bonus bits sprinkled at the end before we do the Q&A. So what do we mean by focusing on decision making? Well, let's first take a look at this quote from a now friend of mine, who's the Assistant Vice President of Compliance from a large financial institution here in the States. She said, rather glowingly, I'll admit, working with decision management solutions was very easy, Charlotte. Was able to take our process and break it down step by step into logical decisions that help make our process flow easier and more efficiently. She was very effective in helping guide us how to create decision diagrams, tables, and identify any data gaps that needed to be filled. She's a bit of a gem. I'm a big fan of hers. But to focus on the decision making, let's look at the kind of darker, bolder words here. So breaking it down step by step into logical decisions, easier and more efficiently. And first by creating diagrams. So I'm sure that many of you here have the context, but if not, or if you want a refresher, you've probably experienced a team that operates chaotically. How would you fix that? Well, you'd probably start by coming up with a process that describes how things should be done. Well, decision modeling works in conjunction with your process. If yours isn't great now, decision modeling can help, but that's a separate but related, different story. But imagine a process, a gateway, as informed by a decision, directs which path along a process you'll take. The decision's outcome dictates what happens next. They're kind of important. They seem worth ensuring their outcomes are accurate, consistent, defensible, transparent, all those good things, right? Whether you currently have a working process or not, what we do is work through each decision that you make to fully capture all of the detail masked by the little diamond shapes. But kind of a synopsis, a decision model is to a decision as a process diagram is to a process, like those elementary school analogies that we had to do, right? So if you had a process, that's a good place to start to find decisions to model. I pulled this particular one off of the Google. You probably have a process diagram that looks similar to this one. So what we'd do is we'd work through each decision within the process to fully capture all of the detail masked by the little diamond shapes, and we'd model them out. That's kind of quite the undertaking, but baby steps. By even modeling out one decision in your process, you'll reap more than you sow. In this particular case, we've got a double whammy here. This particular decision, consumer fails to respond, question mark, is repeated twice within the process. Double whammy. So how do you figure out which process or which decisions to start with? There's many suitable decision types, but the best ones to prioritize your decision modeling efforts on, especially within the case of regulated industries, we choose to focus on ones that must be made in a transparent fashion for the sake of being defensible to an audit, or maybe to a customer who maybe isn't especially happy that they didn't get hired or underwritten, etc., and wants to know why. Think of the Karens. Somebody's got to think of the Karens. Or non-trivial decisions, like ones made from regulation that are made often and must be made consistently. So again, I'm sure you're all wonderfully aware, but to focus on decision modeling, hopefully now we understand why we would want to, but what does it really entail? So as a brief introduction or reminder, here's a quick recap of the components within a decision model. So within the decision model, first we have our decision requirements diagram, often casually referred to as a decision model because it's much easier to say. But there's, a difference. DRD is a component of a decision model after all. And we have a bunch of shapes. So we have our decisions, which determine an output from a set of inputs, those inputs being either outputs from another decision or subdecision, or data coming in directly in the form of an input data, which are represented here as ovals. So see dealer, an applicant, an application. We choose to represent these input data as lumpy, as opposed to going through and saying, okay, well, an applicant has a name, a date, an address, an age, all these deals. We just represent them in this clean fashion and then further define the data in another level. So on the diagram, we've got decisions, input data, and knowledge sources, the squiggly boxes, as I call them. Here we've got dealer compliance reference. These are expertise, whether within someone's mind or a team's collective knowledge, or laws, regulations, etc. Arrows, of course, show the dependencies. There's no sense of timing or order except along those dependency lines, and each decision or subdecision is considered equal. So that's the diagram portion of a decision model. Next, we've got our decision logic. So given some conditions, what action should you take? Should you sum these numbers together? What's the sum of these? What's the average if we're looking at numbers? Or which of these options is it? So are we compliant? Are we not compliant? Eligible, ineligible, low, medium, high complexity, right? So given some conditions, some allowed values, we get a set of allowed answers as our outcome. And we determine that by using decision logic. And then lastly, we have our data. This decision modeling process helps you identify exactly which data you need in order to execute the model. Only the data, only what's necessary and sufficient, but exactly what you need. And they're like Lego, which makes them the best. So decisions can seem as complex as this super sweet Lego machine, but like this super sweet Lego machine, decisions can be broken down into smaller, simpler pieces that fit very nicely together. Although in the case of this super sweet Lego machine, probably not in a set of Legos you can find at Target. But why would you build with decisions? Well, because they're simple. They often come down to a small handful of conditions that yield an often reusable outcome. So think risk scores when you're thinking about, do I approve this underwriting application? What do I do with it? And the routing side of things. You may use that risk score in two places. Or how these same parts could help build the Tower of Orthanc from Lord of the Rings, or maybe a minion or something. In addition to being the world's largest manufacturer of tires, Lego is also ranked within the top 10 companies for quality control year after year. They're consistent. How well they work together is the gold standard. And speaking of standards, decision tables allow you to document the standard way in which the same set of inputs should be handled, regardless of who's using them. So given the same details about an advisor, you and I should make the same decision as to whether to onboard them or not. And while you probably wouldn't want to share all the details with your customer, you can actually defend your decision when you know how it's made. Our quoted friend, for example, is part of a committee who reviews candidate advisors. If she couldn't attend a committee meeting, there was a chance that the outcome would have been different than it would had she been there. And guess what? She got the fortune of having to explain to that candidate, a particular candidate, why they may not have been approved. Without that standard documented reasoning, that call can be much more uncomfortable than it really needs to be. And if you're in a regulated industry, I don't have to tell you about audits, but I can tell you that decision models and decision tables can make them painless, maybe something close to painless anyway. Maybe that's too far. But if an auditor wants to know why or how you make it a decision the way you did, you can just simply point them to the model and the decision tables. And you probably don't need to say too much more. So along with the Lego analogy, there's a person manually powering that Lego model. In the top right, you can see the hand kind of turning it. You don't have to automate your decisions, but you certainly can. And the process of decision modeling allows you to uncover which parts you can automate and which still need a human touch. So the first way that decision modeling helps to reduce complexity is by separating the decision making from the process doing, and to break down those decisions into easily digestible building blocks that together form the complexity needed to satisfy the regulations that bound your day-to-day. So why do it? When I first started my foray into decision modeling, it was a few years ago, and I was very fortunate enough that I got to go to Hong Kong. That was the first project that I worked on. And as Jacob introduced me, my background is in the defense industry. I was doing systems engineering at a defense contractor where I was using the math background that I had. Very different kinds of things from this kind of business consulting world that I find myself in these days. So I really didn't know much about decision modeling at all. I was fortunate that I got to, work face-to-face with James Taylor, the chart topping one, of course. And I got to see firsthand, along with the subject matter experts who were also learning about this decision modeling thing, how we elicit requirements, how we put them together, how you facilitate that discussion to build a decision model. What are the dependencies? What are all the things that you care about? What are all the things that you need in order to determine things that you find yourself caring about? So at the end of the first week, we were going through the early stages of eliciting requirements and building the decision model. And at the end of one of the sessions, one of the subject matter experts hung back and kind of quietly asked us if it would be possible for him to have a copy of the decision model that we'd been building so that he could incorporate it into the new hire training material. And we're just like, well, duh, it's your decision. It's yours, right? But the idea that just by going through the decision modeling exercise, the SME saw the value in what decision modeling can provide. So by engaging their business team as well as their IT team, all those who define, execute, and are affected by the requirements were able to work together to produce the new source code, if you will, that defines how the decisions should be made and what all is required to get you there. For this particular project, they had an automation in mind. They had been working with green screens and desperately needed to be a part of this century, and if not, also help them withstand the changes in the future, because who knows how things might change, but if you have a framework set, you have a chance. But automation doesn't have to be the end goal to get value out of a decision model. But even if it is, even whether execution is possible or possible yet, there's still value in decomposing the decisions into their component pieces, identifying everything that's required to make a decision, understand which decisions still need to be made manually, for which automation is possible, and which are candidates for machine learning. So decision models are still valuable, even if they're not automated, whether if they have plans to or not yet. So now looking at the logic, this is the part where I have more fun. So the same quote from our same friend, we're now highlighting the logical decisions piece and the tables part of what she had said. So in that she works for a financial firm, she's bound by this FINRA rule. So FINRA rule 3110E, I could, at some point recite it by heart. But it basically says that in order for a financial company to onboard an advisor and remain compliant with this FINRA rule, they need to vet the applicant's character, their business reputation, and qualifications and experience before carrying on. Qualifications and experience are pretty straightforward, pretty black and white. Either you have experience and are qualified, or you don't and you're not. But good character, it's mushy, it's fuzzy. So for the company to be compliant, they need to figure out for themselves what good character means to them. Regulations are often vague like this. Sometimes it's a good thing. They're flexible, right? But sometimes there's too much flexibility, which allows room for many, often contradictory interpretations. They'll tell you where you need to end up, but seldom give you directions as to how to get there. So enter decision logic. Great. We've identified that we need a decision that determines whether or not the candidate has good character. But how do we tell if someone's good? Well, you'll probably need to gather everyone who might know, lock them in a room together, and supply them with boxing gloves and a dry erase marker. But on the other hand, maybe you already have some rules that reference thresholds or particular combinations of attributes in order to explain to someone outside of the know-how why those rules are the way they are. A knowledge source, or in our case, a regulation, whether external or internal, is the answer. They are the why. So in this particular case, for advisor onboarding, the focus of this particular project was to break down the complexity of the requirements. How convenient for this webinar. But in that way, the subset of DMN, the decision model and notation standard that we use to build decision models, that pertain to building a diagram was the key feature there. So not all the tech heavy parts, all the plumbing of the standard were required to make a successful project, based on how they defined what successful was for them. But why do we use decision tables? Well, they're easy. For technical and non-technical business users alike, for those with context and those without, it's not too bold of an assumption that you can read a decision table. Rules are often spoke of in terms of if blank, then blank, right? The rules in that format can be very easily reformatted into a decision table. They clear the clutter of the ifs and thens and line returns. The codey looking rules in the little table say the same thing, right? But they're just more friendly. Which do you think is easier to understand? If given the choice, would you choose a codey looking rule or a nice little decision table? I have no bias, don't worry. But another good thing is that decision tables, they're already in the format the developers need in order to implement them. There's no pseudocode. If I were to write code, well, it would look like this. It would be some mishmash of languages that I don't understand. There's no translation required in order for me to go from the business subject matter experts' brains and the contents of them to what the developers make happen, right? And to boot, it's usually obvious when you're done defining a decision table. You can do some simple verification, say, well, there's 2 options in the first column, there's 2 options in the second column. Therefore, there will be at most 4 rows. The upper limit of the number of rows is well defined. And to validate, you can see that both outcome options are represented in the action column, voila. So in this particularly fun example that I'm rather proud of, I took the song, Should I Stay or Should I Go by The Clash, and represented it both as decision logic, kind of if-then kind of codey stuff, again, in this nonsense language that probably isn't a thing, and DMN compliant decision table. So we would read them exactly the same way. So if you say that you'll be mine, then I'm going to stay. Or if you don't say that you'll be mine and you're willing to put up with double trouble, then I'll also stay. Otherwise, if you don't say that you'll be mine and I can only put up with like a single unit of trouble, then I'm going to go, right? It's the same thing, but it's easier to understand and it's nice and compact. And again, you're done. So again, by taking the need for a well-defined logic as prescribed by the regulations and building it into the form of an easy to read, easy to use decision table, complexity is further broken down. So while decision tables can be used directly for execution, they can also just be used to articulate the more specific parts of the requirements. They need not be executable in their current form. So looking at this particular example, this is close to being ready to plop into an engine, but regardless, it still conveys the logic behind the song. That is, that it is or is not compliant with the techier, more plumbing-related components of DMN, like feel and all that, doesn't make it any less useful in breaking down the complexity of a model. So now that we've talked about the decision logic, let's go even deeper and talk about the data side of things. So we'll focus on this last bit of her quote. Identify any data gaps that needed to be filled. So as I mentioned, I have a math background. Every course that I took in college started with kind of a refresher of logic and proof and set theory and all of those things. Really just how to prove a theorem or a mathematical statement or proposition, right? And two of the main components of a successful proof are that what you have written in your proof is both necessary and sufficient to prove what you're intending to prove. So here we start with data that's necessary. As a company in the 21st century, I can safely assume that you're swimming in data. Appropriate for the start of spring, time to do a bit of spring cleaning, or summer or fall, right? When it starts to be a little bit cooler again. By building a decision model and defining its logic, the data just kind of falls out, right? The process of decision modeling forces you to identify exactly which data you'll need in order to decide everything that you need to decide. Your model will have the lumpy input data. Think customer, claim, application, applicant, right? So the decision tables will tell you exactly which attributes of those input data, those lumpy input data that you'll need. So for a claim, maybe you need the claim date. For a customer, maybe you need their date of birth, etc., right? You can take all of the input data, the entities and their attributes, and build an ERD or an ND relationship diagram that defines your object model for every piece of information that you need. As an added benefit, it also prevents you from pulling data that you have no intention of using to make a decision. Even if you don't ask for gender or name or postal code, no one can claim that you acted any differently because of it. We had a client that, actually it was a similar client that was doing onboarding and approvals. They wanted a bunch of data to pass through to their UI. And it was a bit of a struggle to convince them that this decision model, this object model that we've created for the sake of executing this decision logic, should have only what's necessary to execute that decision logic. Anything you want to have, anything that you want to display on your UI, keep it separate, keep it clean. Because then again, you can't be accused of using any of these things if you're not asking for it. So that's the necessary side of things. That was the decluttering part, right? This is the safely part of decluttering. So we tend to document the information available at the moment of a decision, but a decision model helps you focus on what's necessary. This helps to reduce bloat in a couple of ways. First, it reduces the amount of data being passed back and forth. Maybe I don't need to know everything about your claim history. Perhaps just a few attributes are sufficient. And it ensures that you know which data is sufficient for each decision by tying each piece of data to a specific decision. This also allows reuse when you have to do a larger load. Maybe you haven't checked off the necessary piece for some reason, but you can reuse the logic so you can make some of the decisions, even if you don't have enough data to make all of the decisions. I don't have enough data to automatically process your claim, but I do have enough to tell you what I need for you to provide. Any decision I can make, I can make. So we're trying to decide if we should onboard a potential financial advisor in the case of our friend, right? If you tell me that I need to know about their history of bankruptcies, I'd probably say, okay, fair, but why? What are you trying to glean from their history of bankruptcies? What do you need to know about a bankruptcy in order to make the decision that you're trying to make? Is it enough to know how many you had? If you just had any, what type they were, if they were recent, what is it about bankruptcies and their history of bankruptcies that actually is material to the decision that you're trying to make? Whatever it may be, chipping away the excess to get to the specific little nugget that you actually need in order to make it more obvious what you intend to do with that piece of data. If clarity alone isn't enough, how about time and money? If you've never had the pleasure of filling out a paper security clearance background check form, I'm mildly envious of you, truly. If ever there was a high stakes stack of forms, obviously the point of a background check is to make sure that you're being forthright about absolutely everything, holding nothing back, being very thorough. But surely there's some stuff in there that they're not actively making decisions about me from. As the checkee, I would certainly be glad for any reduction in fields to fill out. And as the checker, same. But as an OCR trainer, that's huge. Any reduction in fields to care about is going to save a lot. Granted, the payoff is well worth it, but it takes a ton of time and money to get an OCR setup going successfully. So knowing exactly which data is needed and in what format and to what end reduces the bloat and increases the clarity masked by the seemingly complex decision area. I've mentioned a couple of places where DMN is the tool that we use to build a decision model, but we don't always use all of the DMN standard when building the decision logic. For example, DMN is a tool. We use it as much as it makes sense to use, but DMN is not the end-all be-all. It describes in great detail most of what's necessary to create a functional, successful model, but not everything. For example, we found on several projects that having a data glossary would be incredibly helpful. Compliance with DMN is somewhat arbitrary when determining tools, technology, architecture, suites of everything that's right for your business, for your project, for your specific needs. But understanding what it does and what it does not do will help you determine your needs for a successful decision modeling implementation for modeling logic and data. So here's the bonus. How do we incorporate analytics? So we would start with a game, if only. So when we're building out a decision model with subject matter experts, we play mini games. One of them is the if only game. If only we knew some piece of information, then we would make a different decision. Data they don't currently have access to or proxies that can take the place of existing data, right? We can be creative, we can use our imagination. And then we ask them to qualify that need. How good would that information need to be in order for it to be useful? By using this technique, you can get answers to the hard questions early on. If you had access to this information, how would it impact your decision making? Would it be a determining factor between hiring someone and not? Maybe not always, but you might change how you onboard them, maybe personalize their training, provide access to a different set of tools rather than the whole suite, or from someone else that had been onboarded as well. Right. And it also changes decision making. So by asking those types of questions, you establish the need for machine learning. You've already done the work to prove how it would fit into your organization, that you would benefit it by modeling out the impact of the information that it would have. All that's left to do is point out to work with the SMEs to decide just how accurate that information needs to be. Sorry about that. There we go. We had a client that told us, about 50% accurate is fine. So like a coin toss would be enough. That was a bit odd and probably won't be the case for you, but all of that in hand, you can actually commit to using machine learning, and that's kind of a big deal. But what if we don't have all the necessary data? Maybe it's too early in the process. Some data may only be available after they submit their application, for example, or maybe it's really, no kidding, just missing. Maybe you just need to find a way to approximate it without spending a bunch of money. This is a good opportunity, as good an opportunity as anything, to try to use the data you do have in creative ways. Decision models show which bits of the model you won't be able to make without the data, so that you can ask the machine learning team to find a way to predict that data instead, potentially by using a proxy. Similar to an early step in the process that's not happening, think of a very tall decision model. If one piece at the bottom is missing, some upstream decisions won't be able to be made. But you can proxy with maybe a Google search, perhaps in place of some very expensive data. But modeling gives you the framework and does the machine learning sales work for them. If you don't want to buy the data that we needed to make this decision because it costs a lot of money, then we can use machine learning. We can make that decision for less money with public or cheaper data that we can use to approximate the more expensive data. That's as accurate as we need it to be. So as a recap, how does decision modeling help to reduce complexity, especially in highly regulated industries? Well, it helps to break down those requirements and those regulations into bite-sized pieces, each of which is entirely manageable, readable, understandable, and maintainable, most importantly. Each of those components acts as a part of the translation of long-winded regulations and in-brain memory to implementable logic. Implementable being different than automatable, right? They try to help, or they help to unpick the mess of data that's available or maybe not available so that you can identify exactly which data is required. And as we just talked about, the process of decision modeling creates a decision model which provides the ultimate framework for considering and successfully implementing machine learning. That's what I've got. I'm ready for you.
Okay, thanks, Charlotte. That was great. I don't know if James warned you, but I'm from more of the process side of the house than the decision side of the house. But I often end up with clients who are doing, helping them through the same kinds of thought exercises of looking at how their business works and so on. Do you ever find yourself having to deal with the sort of the process side as well as the decision modeling side, or do you just guide them only towards the decision model side?
Processes come up, right? Again, they're what
They're
people
inevitable.
are more familiar with. Right, they're inevitable, right? People are just generally speaking more familiar with the concept of a process than this like newfangled decision modeling thing. So when we come in to help people do stuff better, they're like, here's our process, and we're just like, okay, well that's nice. Let's spend a little bit of time looking at it, but let's really focus on just the decisions within the process. So the process that they often bring up is often a guiding point for us to determine which decisions that we should approach first. So it's a occasional first step unless they already know exactly what they have in mind. But generally speaking, at decision management solutions anyway, we focus on the decision solutions.
Do you find that it's the same people, the same analysts that are working with both decision models and process models, or do they separate that as different areas of expertise?
Half and half. I've seen both. But oftentimes the people who benefit most from the decisions being made better are different than the people who are making the processes or, having to update and maintain them.
Right,
so,
right.
Those analysts, the people who are, answering the phones, taking in claims, directly, they're the ones who, know best how something should be handled, a claim and underwriting application, for example. Whereas, what happens after it leaves their hands is not necessarily really interesting to them.
Right, right. So I didn't want to take too many questions from James because he's like throwing some softballs over in the Slack channel there, but he did do one that I found very interesting as well. And this is about how you might have seen decision modeling change when you have customers who already know that they're going to be automating something versus those who are modeling a decision but might not be sure whether they're going to automate it or not. How do you see what's happened with decision modeling in that area?
So I've done projects of both kinds where it's kind of more exploratory. We're just like, hey, look at this cool decision modeling thing. Let's try it on with your stuff. And then kind of use it as almost a pitch versus the projects where like, okay, we know we want to use this decision modeling stuff. Let's do it. Like we intend to use it, pilot it, have it go live, all of that. So the two types of projects have a different kind of feel about them, right?
Right.
Those that have the intent of automation kind of in their sights, whether they're starting with those awful green screens that I've seen too many times in this decade, right? Terrible. Whether they're starting from that or, some like custom fangled piece of technology that their internal folks have cobbled together, and they're trying to make things better, add new fields.
And sometimes it's a matter of budget. Like if they know they're going to be automating, they might have more budget for it. Whereas if they get into the modeling and then say, oh man, this could really benefit from automation, but now we have to go out and get budget for that. I know we see that in the process world as well.
Yeah, absolutely. It's the budget part is always a consideration. You can still have, like I mentioned, there's still value in just building the decision model. Right? Whether you have no intentions to go down like the automation route or not.
Yeah,
For
and
sure.
I think that's true of any of the types of models of these kinds of business models that we work with, whether it's process models or case models or decision models. It's like there's value in understanding what you're doing in the business and using it as a communication tool and not necessarily an automation tool.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. It helps everyone to be more mindful of what they're doing. It kind of plants the seed that, you know, maybe there's a better way to do it. Makes people a little uncomfortable and say, well, this is dumb. I don't want to spend 3 hours doing this. And then you get enough people riled up, or the right people riled up about it. And you're like, oh, you know, maybe we could do something with this, even if it's just for training purposes, to make sure that new people coming in are doing it the right way. Or if we can just directly benefit ourselves in a matter of months, because decision modeling can bring automation very quickly if you've got everybody on board. Either way, you're going to have happy people at the end of it.
Oh, that's good. Okay, now I have a question from Matteo at Red Hat. So this is on the Slack channel, so you can also go over there after the presentation and kind of add any other detail. And just a reminder to people, if you do have a question for Charlotte, you can type it in on the Slack channel and I'll read it out. Or if you want to speak directly, you can raise your hand on Zoom and I will call on you to speak. So Matteo is saying, and he said, if I heard you correctly, you have a background in systems engineering, and he's curious if you saw some crossover between root cause analysis and decision models. And he said in terms of maybe framework parts that translate well to DMN, or concepts that either side could, you know, where you could have some cross-pollination between the two ideas.
Sure. So my background in systems engineering with the defense contractor was another case. And apparently this is just how I like to live my life. I just get thrown into things that I've never seen before and say, go do it. Okay, well, fine. So with the requirements work that I was doing at the defense contractor, they're like, all right, build some test cases, you know, build the procedures for testing these requirements. I'm like, what? What are we doing here? And it was on systems that hadn't been written yet. It was miserable, I would say. I got thrown into it. So a lot of the requirements type work that I was working with, at least the majority of the time, was after the requirements had already come in. And the amount of change requests was kind of alarming. So requirements change, and it was always such a huge big deal with such a glacial kind of world as defense contracting. You know, the government or the customer comes in with a change and they say, oh, you know, actually we need to change this threshold, or this behavior needs to be different, or whatever it may be. And it was just such a kerfuffle. It involved so many people. It took weeks to get something across, like just confirming those requirements and then actually acting upon changing them and validating them was painful. And I could have never imagined at that point that requirements and dealing with them, listing them, gathering them, and working with them as they change and hopefully improve as they change could be as dynamic and kind of smooth as the requirements work that I've seen within the realm of decision modeling. It's two totally different worlds, but more and more decision modeling and the concept is spreading. So I have hope, although in my personal experience, I've only seen the painful side outside of this.
Okay. Any other questions from Charlotte? Do we have, if you're on Zoom and you want to raise your hand, or if something you want to put on Slack? Okay, I'm not seeing anything right now. Certainly, there might be some other things that come up on Slack if you want to check there a little later on and see if there's some additional questions. But thanks very much for an interesting presentation.
And thank you guys. I appreciate your time.